Jim Palmquist, our very own. Usually topics of political nature, but today it's aviation. So thank you, Jim, and I welcome you up to the stage.
All right, good. Thank you. I think I'll just stand out here since we got a. Do you need me on the stage for video reasons? So my name is Jim Palmquist, and I'm an air products retiree, and I've had a bunch of careers. So sometimes if you want to talk about careers, I can go on and on for various careers I've had. I live over in Lower Macungie. Been here about 38 years. From Chicago. Went to school in Pennsylvania, and here I am. I'll start out with the first. Let's go to the next slide. I want to go to the next slide probably, but anyway. Well, we get to the Navy. I'm sorry. I want to start with, before I get to pictures, I'm sorry. I want to start with is an idea that a lot of people don't realize, and this is an idea. A lot of us are technically oriented, but this is a more of a liberal, a broader perspective. Airplanes are actually sculptures. The shape of the wing, the fuse, how the tail is, the length, how the rudder, how the elevators, how it works is actually a sculpture. You got to have engines to run it, and it's a machine, but it's actually a sculpture. A helicopter is a machine. It's like the transmission in your washing machine, your agitator washing machines. A lot of gears, a lot of shafts, and that's what we're going to get into today. My background in this, I flew for the Navy. I actually flew for the Army. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But I flew for the Navy, and I started out in the left-hand aircraft, which is a Beechcraft Bonanza with a military tail. Piston-driven. Now they have turbine models, but I was in the piston age. And then I got into the T-28, the one on the right, which is a Trojan. It's an aircraft very similar to a World War II fighter. It's not as powerful as a Mustang or some of the big ones, but the early this thing outperforms the early fighters in World War II. And the message about it is everything is manual. So every time you do anything, it changes a lot of stuff. And when you add throttle, you get a torque roll because the engine's so big, the aircraft rolls. You have to adjust the stick. You might have your temperature go up, so you have to increase the mixture to move your temperature down. Your prop speed might change. You have to adjust your prop speed. And flying a T-20 is like everything is happening all the time, and there's always things change. Now, you can hog around and just ignore the changes, but the instructor pilot beats you over the head with this helmet, this knee pad. If you don't keep your prop speed at 2,200 RPM and keep your temperature below a certain level, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I think it's a model for business life, by the way. When you're running a business unit, you change something, a bunch of other things change, and you're scrambling to. But anyway, so that's my background there. Let's go into the next slide, and we'll talk more about that. I should have said that T-28 also is a tailhook aircraft, so I've landed on aircraft carriers with that. So I have a good background in helicopters, flew 6 different helicopters. My basic trainer was the top center aircraft, which is the Jet Ranger, turbine, small, 2 seats in the back, 2 seats in the front for pilots, twin rotor, a Bell helicopter. Basic trainer, simple to fly and a lot of fun. The advanced trainer, when I was in the Navy, was transitioning from an old almost World War II version helicopter to the Huey. And I was put in the old class. So my advanced trainer was the orange pumpkin on the lower left, the H-34 Seahorse made by Sikorsky. And this, it's not really World War II, but it's like 1950s technology. Piston driven, again, everything manual, really everything's manual. And it really taught me a lot about the history of helicopters. If you only flew the Huey and the Jet Ranger, you don't really understand how the old days of what underpowered helicopters were and all that kind of stuff. Then I got into the fleet and I flew the upper left-hand helicopter, and that's going to be our subject today. That is an H-2 Sea Sprite. Only 180 were built, maybe 30 crashed over the 20, 30 years they operated. So you don't see them around very much, but they're quite sleek, and I'll tell you more about them as we get into it. As I finished up my time in the Navy, my squadron, the Navy wanted the H-2s that I was flying for anti-submarine warfare on cruisers. So every H-2 they could get, they would convert to an anti-submarine model. And so my squadron went to the H-3, which is the lower center picture. And that is a much bigger helicopter, similar to H-2, but it's much larger, maybe 15 seats in the back and really like a truck. And I've got a couple hours in that. And the right-hand one is the Huey, and I've got a couple hours on Hueys. But primarily my time, I have 1,000 hours in the upper left-hand Sea Sprite. So let's go to the next page here, next screen. This is a close-up of a Sea Sprite. It has retractable landing gear. This model is actually the anti-submarine model, but other than a gray dome, it's the same as what I flew. Twin turbine, 4 rotor blades. And the key is it's all weather. So all weather rescue and utility vehicle. So we're instrument qualified and a lot of fancy features I'll talk about as I get into it. So the back helicopters in the 20s, let's say, people like Sikorsky in Russia, he was an aircraft builder, and he experimented with helicopters. Engines in the 20s were so overweight and underpowered, and helicopters need so much power to operate them that Sikorsky couldn't get anything to work. He had some ideas, but it just wasn't the time to do it. And many people came up with contra-rotating, 2 rotors, contra-rotating, going opposite direction. The Russians have a model that they still fly like that. Some came up with 2 rotor shafts, 15-degree angle, with mixing like egg beater kind of a configuration. And then some people had twin rotor, the Chinooks and the Sea Knights and the Boeing Vertol, the Piasecki. And the reason why they used 2 rotors is they didn't have enough power to have a tail rotor and a main rotor. You lose about 15% of your power running the tail rotor, and the engines are so unpowerful. The Piasecki says, I'm going to have 2 rotors give me lift so I don't have so much trouble. What actually happened was turbines came, the jet engines came, and they're so much more powerful that suddenly helicopter design and flourished. I mean, because you could get so much more payload and performance out of a turbine engine. But so let's go to the next picture, I guess. I'm forgetting what picture I have in sequence. This is actually a picture of one of the ones that we flew out of the aircraft carrier John F. Kennedy. And I've served on maybe 2 carriers intensively. And I've flown off of maybe 6 or 7 carriers, but most of my time was on the John F. Kennedy. And this is an H2 configured for rescue work. What the Navy did is they issued me a camera and said they'd develop all the film I could shoot. And so I've got no end of black and white pictures. In the day, they didn't have color processing on the ship. So we got black and white film. So I got gobs of pictures of that kind of stuff. And that's why it's in black and white. So comparing helicopters and fixed wing, fixed wing airplanes just outperform helicopters intensively. I mean, I don't know the details, but these airliners, they're carrying 250,000 pounds. I mean, the big cargo planes. Well, a helicopter could carry maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 pounds, and maybe a big one could carry 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 pounds. But they're nowhere near what the airliners can do and what the big cargo planes can do. But the airliners fly 600, 700 miles an hour, almost the speed of sound. A helicopter that can go 150 miles an hour is doing pretty good. You just aren't going to get speed out of it. But what you can do with a helicopter, of course, is hover and land just about anywhere. I mean, you'd like to be on preferred, like airports and parking lots and stuff, but you can hover a helicopter literally any place on the earth, and it has certain features that really make it stand out. Let's go to the next picture. I wanted to explain to you to make sure you all have an understanding how a turbine engine works. This is a cutaway of a jet engine, and at the end, well, I'll flip it over into helicopters. But for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to be talking about airliner engines, corporate jet engines, not helicopter engines, though they're very similar. I think I'll use the picture up here to see if I can. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see this. Maybe you can. So the aircraft is moving that direction. The air is coming in where these blue lines are, and it's being compressed. And this turbine has 17 stages of fans, 1 shaft, and all these fans. And the fans are like, the bigger ones might be that big a blade, and down the smaller ones are really small, and they're all in races. And as they spin, they're actually sucking air in at a tremendous rate. The amount of suction in this thing, I think airliners actually suck their way forward to some extent. And what happens is the orifice that it goes into and the way the fan blades, each row is a little different bend to it. When you get about halfway through, the air is about 150, 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And they port, just by being compressed, they port off hot air to run their heaters at the 5th or 6th stage turbine pressure. And the pressure here at the end of the compression stage is just phenomenal. I don't know what it would be. And it enters a fire can, a combustion chamber, and you've got jet fuel coming in maybe 6 or 8 cylinders around the engine as the air comes in there. And when the aircraft starts, there are glow plugs, they're called igniters, that click. And when you turn on the engine, an electric motor in here starts turning the compressor stage. And when it gets up to a certain percentage of speed, you add fuel. And as soon as you add fuel, the igniters start clicking. You're going click, 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 click. And once the fire is established, the igniters go out. And the fire remains in the engine with no other, it's just retained here. Now the blast coming out of here, when this hot air gets expanded with the fire, the blast coming out the back comes out of a jet engine. You know, it's a phenomenal amount of air. But there's a problem. How do you run this front end? How do you keep the front end turning? So the blast goes through what's called a power turbine here. This is the power turbine. And the blast turns these blades, turns a shaft to run the front end. And so you lose, you know, you don't realize it, but you lose some proportion of the output of the engine to drive the front end. But you have to drive the front end to make the compressor work. So it's, you know, I don't know what I'd say, probably 80-90% of the blast goes out the back. But you do have that kind of a situation going on. Now, power turbine jet engines give you about a pound of horsepower. I'm sorry. A turbine engine gives you about 4 pounds of horsepower per pound of dry weight. So if you got a 300-pound engine, you get about 1,200 horsepower. A piston engine gives you about 1 pound of horsepower per pound of weight. If you've got a 400-pound engine, you got 400 pounds of horsepower. So that's where turbines have this tremendous capacity to put out energy better than piston engines with really advanced helicopters. So you can imagine with a helicopter, you don't really want a big blast come out the back. You know, you need something turning. You need a rotating shaft to turn all the hardware, right? So a helicopter, this is a turbojet engine what's imaged here. Now I'm talking about a turbo shaft engine. There's another power turbine and a turbo shaft engine behind the power turbine that drives the front end, and that has a shaft coming out the back of it, and that gives you rotating drive shaft to turn the equipment. These turbines run up to 19,000 revolutions a minute, so the bearings have got to be phenomenal. You know, they just have to be perfect. And of course, the head bearing is really significant, because this core is trying to fly out the front of the engine. So the main bearing in the front is really the star of the whole show. So what they do with turbines and helicopters is they put a gearbox right in the back of the engine, attached to the engine. It's actually installed together, called a speed reducer. And that reduces the speeds down to the helicopter, the H2 that I'm talking about, is around 6,000 RPM. Still a lot, but a 19,000 RPM bearing would really be a challenge. It'd be an expensive and highly machined bearing. The other great thing about turbo shaft and turbojet engines, they're very reliable. In terms of moving parts, there's just 5 or 6 bearings running down the line, and that's about the whole thing. If you ever see a cutaway of a piston engine, I mean, the piston engines I had, what do you call it? Not fuel injection, but air compressors to get more air into them, and a lot of machinery, a lot of valves, and Crocker arms and all this kind of crap. They're quite reliable, but these things are even more reliable. So that is and by the way, if you have questions, I shouldn't just lecture you. If you have questions, speak up. But this is the key. Once these turbo shaft engines became available for helicopters, helicopter technology just took off. Reliability, more power, less weight, and increased performance significantly. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll see what we have coming next. This is a cutaway. I'm sure if at home, Brian, you're probably going to have a hard time seeing this. Can you guys see this well enough? Yeah, it's not important you see every piece of it, but this is a cutaway, the H2 I was talking about earlier. And you can see this is an engine intake, and this is the compressor, and there's the power turbine, and then the exhaust turns 45 degrees and blasts out to the side. And you can't see it, but there's a gearbox sitting right behind here that gets the speed down to 6,000 RPM. And out of that gearbox is a short shaft. And in here, I'm not sure it's really depicted, but there's a big gearbox laying across the back. I mean, it's about 2.5 feet, maybe 6-8 feet wide, maybe, I don't know, foot deep. And the shaft comes out of this engine, goes into that gearbox. And the gearbox is just a big gear with another gear right across. Splash lubricated. It's actually oil pump lubricated, I think. But it takes the shaft out of the speed reducer into this big gearbox and combines them into a shaft that comes out of that combining gearbox into the main transmission. Below the rotors is the big gearbox. So right below the rotors is a big gearbox. So we've got the turbine, a speed reducing gearbox, a combining gearbox, and a main transmission. Of course, the other side is another turbine, and it fits the other side of this combining gearbox. and combines into the main gearbox. You're hearing a lot of machinery here, but this isn't exactly a sculpture, right? We're not done yet. Out of the main transmission is another shaft that runs under this cover to a small gearbox we call the intermediate gearbox. And at the end, I'll tell you more about that. I lost one of these and almost killed myself. And then there's a 90-degree gearbox called the tail rotor gearbox. So we've got 6 gearboxes and 2 turbines in this. And this is why I say an airplane is a sculpture and a helicopter is a machine. Now, it's true that rotor blades are aerodynamic. I mean, they're wings, basically. That really is the reason why I call it a machine rather than a sculpture. So let's go to the next slide, Bill, and we'll...
Hey, Jim.
Yeah.
Just asking about the gearboxes, is that a direct drive? I mean, is the rotor speed directly proportional to the engine speed, or is there a clutch? Is what I'm asking.
There is a clutch.
Okay.
It is a direct drive. The one thing that, so I'll step back to the tangent a little bit. You have a ceiling fan at home. Oh, here's one right here. It has fixed blades and it probably has 3 speeds, low, medium, and high. And you can change the amount of air running through it by changing the speed. Helicopter is the opposite. Helicopter rotor speed is fixed, more or less fixed. The blades change pitch. I'll get more into that. So you're actually maintaining a constant speed, but you've got to have a clutch between each engine. So if the engine craps out, it doesn't shut down the rotor system. In other words, if the engine slows down, the clutch automatically releases, and the other engine drives the combining gearbox and drives the system. Good question. So you're dealing with it as you was thinking about differentials and transmissions in cars and all that kind of stuff. It's the same.
I'm used to automobiles. That's why.
Yeah, it's cars. That's why I'm thinking most of us know automobiles. All right, this is a cutaway of a pilot's cockpit. I mean, a cutaway, a schematic, really a brief diagram, but I think it's a good place to start. Now, I'm going to try and talk about helicopters and fixed wing at the same time because they're flown very similarly. Let's start with the rudder pedals. And in this image, the rudder pedal, Brian, can you see that well enough or no?
Just fine.
Okay. The rudder pedals are in green. And if you want to go left, you push the left pedal forward. And in the fixed wing airplane, the rudder at the back shifts based on the rudder pedal push and it goes to the left. So the rudder, it goes to the left. So the rudder pedal causes the airplane to go to the left. Just a fine point for you aviators. That's not the only thing you have to do a left turn. You also put some stick in it. A fixed wing airplane, you give it left pedal and a left stick. If you just give it left pedal, you'll be thrown out to the centrifugal force will throw you out to the right. And anything on you loose will fight up against the door of your airplane. If you bring it a little stick, you keep the center of gravity aligned with your spine, and you make a nice turn like a roller coaster does. In other words, if you ever ride the Wild Mouse, the Mighty Mouse, it does 90-degree turns flat, and you get thrown to the side, left and right. The high-speed roller coasters don't do that. They go down and they have a track to keep their center of gravity aligned. So a proper turn in these aircraft is a little left stick and a little left rudder, what's called a coordinated turn. So now let's talk about a helicopter with a rudder. If you want to make a left turn, you push the left pedal, just like fixed wing. Well, what's happening? If you're in a hover, there's no air going across your tail. So you have a fan back there, and you're actually changing the pitch of the rotor blades and the tail rotor to cause the fan to move air another direction to keep yourself going in a turn. Think about it. If you didn't have a tail rotor, and you've got an aircraft and you've got a main rotor going this direction, you don't have a tail rotor, the fuselage is going to operate opposite of the main rotor, spinning up to rotor speed. I have about 10 seconds flying that way. At some point, I'll get into that, but it was not planned. So anyway, so basically the green rudder pedals cause the pitch change in the tail rotor to keep your heading going straight. The Chinooks and other aircraft have other tricks, but the vast majority of single rotor helicopters, they all operate this way. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about is fixed wing. We talked about the stick a little bit. I'll talk about a little bit more. So in a fixed wing airplane, when you push the stick to the left, the lift on the right-hand wing increases. There's a little flap called the aileron, and it drops down and it creates a longer cord across the top than the bottom of the wing, and that causes that wing to climb. And the other aileron goes the other direction and it reduces lift on that wing. So as you give it left stick, The right wing rises and the left wing decreases. And that's actually how you make a turn. Pretty convenient. Well, it turns out a helicopter is quite similar. We in helicopter world call the stick, we call it a cyclic. And I'll get to that in a minute why we call it a cyclic. So in a helicopter, you put in left stick. The right rotor blade has to increase pitch a little bit to increase lift, and the left rotor blade has to decrease pitch. However, they're rotating at 5 revolutions a second. So the blade that's in the climbing position is in the neutral position, is in the lower lift position, back to neutral 5 times a second, about almost 300 revolutions a minute. And this is where the machinery of helicopters really gets sophisticated. And I'm not going to go into all the details about that, but that's the key to helicopters. Basically, if you had a camera at the end of the rotor blade, it's wobbling. It's probably, I don't know what the pitch changes are, but they're minimal. But it's wobbling continuously because you're doing this 5 times a second, almost 300 revolutions a minute. And the reason why we call the stick on a helicopter a cyclic is it changes the rotor pitch in cycles. Increased pitch, neutral, lower pitch, neutral, and then you call that a cyclic. So a fixed wing pilot and a helicopter pilot, pretty much interchangeable. There's a few quirks I'll tell you about, but they're pretty much interchangeable as far as that's concerned. They both use left rudder and left stick to go left, right, or right stick to go right. If an airliner, so an airplane, a fixed wing airplane wants to climb, they pull the nose up, right, start climbing. It takes more power to climb than to maintain level flight. So you have to add throttle, and a lot of it's done automatically. And you put your nose up, and now you're climbing with some more throttle. Helicopter doesn't, that's not really too relevant to helicopters. It just doesn't how they work. The helicopter has this device called a collective, and it's a pink control. Again, the pilot sits in the right in the helicopter, pilot sits on the left in a fixed wing airplane, but the controls are duplicate in both. So if a helicopter wants to climb, he lifts up on the collective. Again, you have to add power because it takes more power to climb than to maintain level flight. And in the collective, there's not only a pitch change, but there's a throttle built into it, automatic. So in turbines, it's all very sophisticated. You don't even think about throttle. But what the collective does is it collectively changes the pitch. So if you're climbing, all 4 positions of the rotor blades all increase pitch the same amount. You understand? In other words, if you're climbing, you got to have, and you want to go straight up, you've got to be able to change the pitch collectively, all increase or decrease. And the key is, so if you want to make a climbing left turn, left rudder, left cyclic, and some up collective, and all those controls have to be mixed to give your rotor system the right information. So it's not only gearboxes that make this a machine, but this rotor control business took them years and many experiments and probably a lot of crashes to figure out how to make all this machinery work. And it's quite reliable. It's, that's why helicopter people fly without getting killed every flight. But it was very difficult to figure out. And if anybody really wants to know more about this, we can go down to the American Helicopter Museum in Westchester, Pennsylvania, outside of Westchester, Pennsylvania, at Brandywine Airport, and actually see this machinery working. They have working models. You can actually go up and see a helicopter and see how the swash plates work and all this kind of stuff. I will say one other thing about it. So rotors rotating at 300 revolutions a minute have tremendous centrifugal force. And there's a bearing at the base of the blade allowing it to change pitch. You'd expect that. You're not going to bend the blade. You have a bearing to change the pitch. It turns out the centrifugal forces on the middle size and larger helicopters like I flew are so strong that the pilot's not strong enough to enter the controls and change the rotor system. So there's a power steering feature, a hydraulic servo unit that multiplies the pilot's force. So these devices are pretty sturdy, but they're not sturdy enough to change the pitch. But the controls go through the floor and up between the pilots in a closed panel or behind the pilot or behind the co-pilot. The controls are mixed into a hydraulic unit that has a gyroscope in it. The hydraulics and the gyroscope work together to give you a pitch change. I'll talk more about rotor blade pitch change in a minute. Maybe I'll go to that. So I'm going to step back a minute and talk about fixed wing airplanes. There are little trim tabs that you can make fine adjustments on your ailerons and your rudder in the cockpit of larger airplanes, maybe not smaller ones, but larger airplanes. And so you can actually take an old-fashioned fixed-wing airplane, adjust the trim tabs, and fly level for a while. And then eventually it gets out of adjustment. You got to keep adjusting it. And that's because the sculpture that is a fixed-wing airplane is designed to be stable. It's designed to be level and everything's fine. Helicopter, there is no level. There is no, I mean, if you didn't have false stuff in there, the thing would do loops and flip around. It would be crazy. So there's a gyroscope in the hydraulic servo unit that helps the helicopter feel like it's got a straight and level horizon. And in fixed wing, if you want to go left, the more left you get, the more resistance you get. And you can feel it. And it sort of helps you feel how you're doing. The gyroscope creates that for helicopter pilots too. Again, a helicopter pilot is a big machine, but it doesn't have any stable position. The gyroscope gives it that stable position. So that's a cyclic, collective. Oh, by the way, there's going to be a quiz at the end. You're ready. You're okay. Sorry, a fun quiz. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll see this is what I flew, and this is what they call steam gauge now. The current models are all glass cockpit, and they're television screens. You can rearrange instruments software-wise and really fancy. But this is an aircraft that's got the remote attitude indicator for instrument flying, and in this area, we share, each pilot's got duplicate instruments for instrument flying, but we share the engine instruments. What they did is there were 4 instruments in each engine, and they turned the gauge and the knob so they're all in. If things are all right, all the white needles are in line. So you don't ever read the instrument. Say, is it all in line? Go to the next thing. If something's at 30-degree angle, you say, whoa, what the hell's going on there? But turbines are so great. I never had a turbine problem in flying 1,000 hours. So this is the cyclics. The pilot seat and the co-pilot seat. And this is the tip of the collective. They put a lot of machinery in. They have a lot of gauge buttons and knobs you got to have. We had a lot of circuit breakers above. We had radios between the pilot and co-pilot running back. And a lot of this is instrument flying information. This gauge here is unique that you would never heard about if you haven't seen this type of aircraft. This aircraft shoots a Doppler signal to the ocean. It doesn't shoot from 400 feet, but from like 100 feet on down. And you can be, let's say you're at night, there's a person in the water, jet pilot's in his raft, and you find him, and you get a hover over him. The pilot can't see him. I mean, the guy's down below, and the crewman is actually managing the rescue and telling the pilot what to do. But with this instrument and the Doppler signal bouncing back, the helicopter can measure drift. And the little circle in the middle is where the guy is. And if the white lines are above or below, left or right, it means you're drifting and you get it back to center. Again, the crewman that's in the back is actually managing the rescue. The pilot gets you to the rescue, but the crewman in the back actually runs it. We'll tell the pilot through intercom, hey, move left a little bit, move left, move right, whatever needs to be done. So that's an idea of what the cockpit is like. Also, I was going to point out the tachometer. I don't even see it here now. Yeah, this is a tachometer. You've got 3 RPM gauges, one for the main rotor and one for each engine. So if you see an engine dropping off, you can tell right away which engine it is, and usually they're locked together in that gauge. Let's go to the next picture, Bill. Now, this is a crappy shot. I'm not going to be able to show you anything here because the details aren't that great. But so I've alluded to the machinery of the main rotor. Said that there's a bearing that allows the pitch to change. And that's, I don't know where it is in this picture. It's such a crappy picture. One of the problems we have is that when I got out of the Navy, right after I got out, the Navy changed the rotor system on the H2 that I flew. So there's one on display. There's an H2 on display at the helicopter museum, but it has a different rotor system than I know. And these are the rods that are coming out of the hydraulic unit and through some other machinery that actually change the pitch. And so collective and cyclical changes are managed through those 4 rods. It turns out aerodynamically, there's a lot of machinery here that I haven't told you about. There are reasons why the rotor blade may need to be ahead a couple degrees or behind a couple degrees if it's 90-degree position. Aerodynamic reasons. So there's a dampener that if the aircraft needs to have the rotor move ahead or behind 90-degree position, the dampener gets it right back to level. you can imagine if you've got a rotor system spinning at 300 revolutions a minute and it's off balance with one rotor blade near the other one that's 90-degree position, you can actually get some violent vibrations going if you want to stop. There's another issue with flapping. Occasionally a gust will come along. Oh, so let me step back a bit. So the lead lag, there's a hinge in each rotor blade allowing a little bit of lead lag dampener to get it together. Now, there's also a need to have a flapping function. Occasionally, a gust of wind comes up, and there's a bunch of other reasons why you may need to flap. There's another hinge in each rotor blade allowing flapping. So I've said pitch change, lead lag hinge, flapping hinge. There are anti-coning stops. You don't want the rotors to get up too high. So there's a stop where the rotors can only get so higher than straight level. And there's a droop stop. If you didn't have a droop stop, you got done shut down for the end of the day, you turned off your rotor system and it went down to zero. The rotor tip might be 3 feet off the ground or 4 feet off the ground, decapitating people. So there's a droop stop that keeps the rotors, when it slows down about 50% of the normal RPM, a droop stop comes in to keep them about 7 feet so you don't decapitate people. And there's other machinery in there also. Can you see how difficult it might have been to develop helicopters when you've got lead lag, all these functions, and that's why it took so damn long. And the key was power plants. We did that. Let's see. I was going to say a few words about. Let's go to the next picture. I'm not even sure what I have coming next year. Oh, so this is an H2 that's on display at the Battleship New Jersey. If you go on the Battleship New Jersey over in the fantail, there's an H2 parked. It's a rescue model, it's an anti-submarine model. I'm sorry, but it's in the colors of the rescue ones I flew. Aboard ship, we'd fold the rotor blades. You had to have, you couldn't park a hangar deck. You couldn't park something with 45 feet of diameter. So there are racks you put on the aircraft, and the crew can break the rotor blades and actually fold them away. In terms of other systems, so I'm talking about a 4-bladed H2 helicopter. The 3-bladed and the 5-bladed are all similar. They all have the flapping and all this fancy stuff. What's different is the Bell products and the Robinson products. They have 2-bladed rotor systems. And they're just teeter-totters. They're much simpler than all this machinery and these fully articulated heads. And you've seen the bells with 2 blades on them. And if you ever look at their rotor system, it's a much simpler system. I don't know why it isn't selling better. I mean, they've sold tens of thousands of that system. But even Bell is moving to 4-bladed systems. And I guess 4-bladed maybe works better. One other thing about all this machinery that I think you might find interesting. I was up at Sikorsky. I gave a talk at Sikorsky about these and about naval aviation. They're developing with a company called Lord Corporation out of Erie. They're developing an elastomeric rotor system. Instead of having all this machinery, lead lag, flapping, all this fancy machinery, they think layers of elastomeric plastics with layers of metal, that they can take a lot of that functionality and put it into a fixed structure. You don't have to lubricate it, you don't have to maintain it. It's just built into the rotor system. And Sikorsky's been developing that for a while. So let's see, what I want to go to the next slide. Yeah. So what's it like to ride? Have any of you ridden a helicopter? Okay, most everybody has. Hey. So some days is rough and some days is nice. I flew a lot in Pensacola, and in the summer down there in the heat, sun's burning down on the earth, heating the earth, and then the earth heats the air, and all of a sudden you have hot air rising and cold air falling, and all that vertical. If you're at 500 feet or 1,000 feet, you feel it in this helicopter because you're bouncing along and banging along, and it's a rough ride. Other days when you're up at 3,000 feet and a cooler around here, you hardly ever have that burble. But so it can be a little bit of a rough ride. If you're flying off an airport, you don't notice it. But if you park one of these things in a parking lot, you're going to have a mess because every single thing that's loose is going to be stirred up, and it's going to go up in big shafts of air, and it's going to go up through the rotor system again. And you're going to have, if you flew over like a recently cut down cornfield, you might go in inhuman conditions with all the debris because everything that's loose, this thing's going to stir up. And a lot of it's going to be sucked into the rotor system as it goes around and around. And, I flew for the Army also for a couple of years with the National Guard. And they do a lot of flying around, crappy conditions. Let's go back. I'm going to go put some more pictures about the H2. A helicopter is great for eyeballing, looking at stuff and seeing stuff up close because you're not going at such a high speed. And if you have to, you can take a 360 turn and go back and look at something again. That's certainly great. And say this thing, we say 150 knots, about 170 miles an hour was the max. But at 170 miles an hour, it was such a rough ride. We figured we're just damaging this equipment, beating it up so much. So we stayed about 120 knots, maybe 140 miles an hour when we traveled, which is pretty good because you can go line of sight at 140 miles an hour. You can make it, from Harrisburg to Philadelphia pretty quickly. So this aircraft, again, I think I mentioned it has retractable landing gear. The rescue is done from the other side, and the gear blocked the rescue. So we always flew with landing gear off. One other thing I can tell you about. So the aircraft has a lot of lift in the rotor system. You can actually carry more. So you could be in a position with enough cargo or people on your helicopter that when you pull in full power, you don't actually enter flight. You can actually be so heavy that the rotors are doing all that they can. The engines are at max power, and you can't go into a hover. Hover is the most power demanding function of a helicopter, but you might be able to still take off. And that's why we have wheels on this thing. You can go out to a runway and tip the rotor system forward. In other words, parked on the runway with the rotors turning without much load on them, they're horizontal to the earth. But if you tip the front forward and the back, you push the stick forward, now the air is going to go through the rotor system, putting you back, and the aircraft will start rolling. And aerodynamically, this system has more lift at above 15 miles an hour. So you can be at a fixed power setting, rolling down the runway, and the aircraft will take off on its own as it gets translational lift. As the whole system actually increases its lift. So you can actually take off with more weight than you can't hover with. And then as you burn down fuel, you can hover at the destination because you've cut down the weight. So that's sort of a cool thing. One of the nice things this has, it has spotlights. So if you're in a night rescue, you can light up all the ocean or the ground around you, so the crewman who's in the back managing the rescue, managing the hoist can see. Of course, we have a hoist that can carry 600 pounds, and it's got 2 hooks on it. So we had a second crewman that we'd throw in the water. If the person in the water was drowning or was stuck on their parachute shrouds or whatever, the senior crewman in the back would say, "I'm going to put the rescue crewman in the water." We'd go down to 15 feet on our radar altimeter, and the senior crewman would push the wet crewman out with his fins and his UDT vest, take a knife and cut the person out of her shrouds or pull their head out of the water. And then we had a hoist that we'd bring them both up at the same time. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about how we learned to fly a helicopter. And it turns out flying a helicopter is like riding a bicycle. You remember how you learned to ride a bicycle? Yeah, but I mean, you don't really know, I don't think. Yeah, your dad held or your mom held your bike, you had training wheels. But what actually happens is your brain says, "Oh, I understand this system. I've got to pedal a certain speed. I've got to manage my weight." And it's not something you do consciously. It's something your body senses and you understand how to do. At least that's my impression. Helicopters the same thing. I flew a lot fixed wing before I flew helicopters. And one day, the first day I had a helicopter flight, I got in the Jet Ranger in the pilot seat as the student. And my co-pilot was an instructor pilot. He said, "We're going to have you hold the rudder steady. I'm going to take care of the collector. I'm going to take care of the You keep the rudder. See that tree over there? Keep the nose pointed at that tree." How tough could that be, right? So I'm sitting there with my feet in the rudder pedal. All of a sudden, I start drifting left. I put in too much right. Now I'm oscillating further and further. And your brain says, "Oh, I understand this. You've got to do much finer controls." It's like a video game. You ever had a video game? The first time you use it, you say, "I don't know how to, like flying an airplane on a computer monitor. Oh, this is a mess." Your body figures out how to do it. And I don't know it's conscious. You just know. And we did the same thing. So, okay, I'm in a 40-foot hover, Jim. I'm taking care of the rudder and the cyclic. You take care of the collector. Keep us at 40 feet. Oh, I'm going, what could be difficult? All of a sudden, you're at 42 feet, and you're 37 feet, and 40. All of a sudden, your brain says, "Oh, fine tuning. And that's actually how you learn to fly a helicopter. Now, flying a helicopter, that part of flying is not the key issue. The key issue is How does the equipment work? How do emergency procedures work? How do your tactics work? How do you do rescues? How do you bring up cargo? All that kind of stuff. That's really the complex part of flying a helicopter. The flight controls is pretty much the simpler part. So if you're going to go on a flight to the military, you got a mission. The operations department's going to go rescue pick up somebody or whatever needs to be done. You go to weather brief. Every flight, the pilot writes up a yellow sheet. How'd the flight go? Any gripes? And if they say, "Oh, this is wrong. This part of the thing doesn't work. This needs to be worked on," you go back and read what the maintenance guy said after the last 4 or 5 flights. Here's the gripe, and here's what the maintenance guy did about it. You agree that he did a good job? If not, you might ask him more questions, or if so, you go back to the airplane and say, "I'm going to watch for this problem because this problem might still be there." So you've got your yellow sheets checked out. Then you do a pre-flight inspection. The pilot has certain things he looks at. The co-pilot has certain things he looks at. And we swap the role. So you're back and forth. Pilot and co-pilot. Our 10-man detachment. We had 4 helicopters and 10 pilots. And we just alternated. So you had 2 different roles you had to keep up with. So there's a pre-flight inspection. You intensively climb up on the top and look at the rotor system and open the engine compartments and look for problems there. And then there's a pre-start checklist. Before you start, you turn off all the switches basically, but you just 20 or 30 things you go through to make sure everything's shut down. And then you go to the pre-start checklist, and then you start. Now you got your turbines running. You release the rotor brake, and the turbines come up to you. Move your fuel control up to fly. I haven't talked about that, but the fuel control is controlled by the collective. But to go from idle to the 100% RPM is another flight condition bar we push. So then we do a pre-takeoff checklist, make sure everything's in order, make sure you got power clearance, and off you go. Now, one of the things too, we're doing good on time. We still want to go another 10 minutes? Okay. I don't have too much more to hit on. One of the main things people don't realize about helicopters is that they're safer to land power off than fixed wing. A lot of people think helicopters fall in the sky like a rock. If the engine stops, you're a dead weight and you're all dead at the end because you crash. It turns out it's better to be in a helicopter than a fixed wing airplane with a power off landing. The reason for that is a fixed wing airplane has a stall speed. In other words, there's a speed at which the sculpture no longer flies. In the P-28, I think it was about 68 knots, 75 miles an hour. If you go to 72 miles an hour, your lift is going to go away. One wing's going to fall off, and you're going to corkscrew 2,000 or 3,000 feet. And if you're 500 feet from the ground, you're dead. You have to maintain above stall speed to keep the aircraft flying. So you can glide and maintain above stall speed, but maybe you're doing 80, 90 miles an hour. Now you're hitting the ground at 90 miles an hour. If you're on a runway, that's not a problem. Put the wheels down and roll out. But if you're in the woods, you're now traveling through the woods at 90 miles an hour. And what they always said to us, don't steer your T-28 if you have a power off landing into a big tree. Go for the brush and let the trees take the wings off. And that's your strategy, but you're still landing maybe 80, 90 miles an hour in the woods. Helicopter has another aerodynamic trick. In powered flight, it's a fan blowing air down. I think that's pretty obvious. As you have a power failure, the wind inverts. In other words, you fall a few feet, but the wind actually starts going up through the rotor system and drives the rotor system. So you maintain your 100% rotor speed around 300 knots. And now you've got full maneuverability. You're actually driving the combining gearbox through the rotor system. Oh, by the way, the combining gearbox has your generators and your hydraulic pumps and all your accessories being driven. So you have all your electronics, all your lights, all your equipment operating by the wind pushing the main rotor like an auto gyro kind of a thing. And so now you can maneuver and you can line up for where you're going to make your touchdown. And at about 150 feet, you're going down at maybe 60 or 70 knots. A couple different reasons why you might have different, but one's for max range, one's for max descent rate, I guess. About 150 feet, you flare and move the aircraft from maybe 60 or 70 knots to 0 airspeed. you rock over the spot you want to touch down. And as you settle down, you pull up in the collective, increase the pitch in the rotor blades, and take the inertia off the main rotor and cushion your landing. And if you do it right, no damage. I mean, it's a polite landing. Your rotor's maybe at 80, 90% of RPM. And you just let it, put your rotor brake on, shut it all down, and call your maintenance guys, hey, come on, help me. So every training flight, you have a simulated power off landing. Every time you go flying a training flight, somewhere in that flight, the instructor pilot's going to simulate a power off landing, put the collective down, and we don't touch down because you can have hard landings and bust up the landing gear. Well, you recover at a 40-foot hover, bringing power back on. But so a helicopter, and this is called an auto rotation, and if it's done right, everybody walks away without injuries, and the aircraft's not damaged unless you get stuck with the rotor blades. So again, if you ever want to go down to see this stuff hands-on, we have an Osprey down at the American Helicopter Museum. I'm certified to take you into. It's sort of the Osprey is the compound airplane that takes off like a helicopter and rocks forward into a forward flight. And I flew 6 helicopters in the Navy. I think I missed one to telling you about, and that's the Loach, the Army helicopter I flew. All 6 are on display at the Helicopter Museum. And the H-2 that I've got most time in, the one at the museum is in my flight log. One day I flew that thing many, many years ago. So let's go to the last picture, I guess. This is a picture of another squadron that was operating off of cruisers. And it's an H-2, and you can see the deck is pitching. An aircraft here is pretty flat all the time. But in a cruiser or a big destroyer, you're rocking back and forth. And this is not only chocked down at the wheels, but he's got his high chock so the aircraft doesn't get damaged by all the pitching. I've never been tied down that way, but I've been on cruisers, not that steep, but I've been sliding around the deck of cruisers, picking up people and stuff. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
Did you land in? What cool airports did you land in?
Oh, I've been at Athens. Landed at Athens, landed at Naples. Palma. Then we shuttle people in and out of the airports, and fall to top and hog our way in. Others I can't think of anymore. But yeah.
Any difference between the kind of helicopters you're talking about and some of the electric helicopters that are coming out?
Yeah. I guess that's our future. The problem is batteries weigh a lot. And how are you going to get enough electricity to run them? The American Helicopter Museum has a prototype that had maybe a 20-minute flight life. It's actually like a drone. It's a one-seater with maybe 6 blades, but the weight of the batteries is so high you couldn't really get much distance out of it. I think the technology is going to advance, but apparently that's coming. Helicopters by that electric. All right, any other questions? I want to say just a couple of things too. Pete and I plan to go to the Freedom from Religion Foundation's annual global convention in Boston here. Pete had a family issue and he couldn't go, but I did go up there a week ago for about 3 or 4 days. And at some point, if you want, I'll give you a report on that. I don't know what venue will do, but I have a lot of thoughts. It's a good group. I mean, they're doing great work, I think. And I took a look at the 990 form, the IRS 990 form. And they're really big. I mean, last year they filed a $13 million revenue. That might be twice what they've ever done. I didn't go back further, but they're quite a bit bigger than American Humanists, much bigger than American Atheists, and they've got 8 lawyers, and they have a lot of good things going on. The other thing I wanted to suggest, and this is for long-term future, Paul and I and Dave Menser and Barca did a little program a couple years ago, lobbying. We met with Notstein, the Republican candidate for rep, Wild, and also the guy that was a libertarian. And we also met, Dave and I met with, got his name, but anyway, the black pastor in Allentown, Edwards, yeah. And we also, Brocious and I met with the Morning Call editorial board. And our agenda, Paul remembers well, was to say, we're humanists, we're out here, we're about 25% of the electorate, and we're maybe 35% of the younger people. And we sort of set our position. With the new Senate seat open, with Toomey not running, I'm not proposing that we take a leadership role in doing that lobbying for the Senate seat in Pennsylvania. I reached out to the Secular Coalition of America, and they would be glad to help us do that. And we'd have to organize it with FFRF and other people, because there may be some other effort. I like to have one effort for humanists, free thinkers in Pennsylvania to get our agenda in front of these people. And the other thing is the Free Thought Society has a chapter in Central Florida that has had, I think they've done 40 people have done 60 invocations at city meetings in Central Florida. I think we ought to think about doing that here. See where there are invocations that are, Central Florida free thinkers would rather have no invocation, but they can't really cause that to happen. But they assert that there ought to be some atheists, some Muslims, some Christians, some, Wiccan invocations, and a lot of cities have said the hell with invocations. But maybe we ought to start an effort here to see what townships are doing and cities are doing down here. And the Central Florida free thinkers on their website have a lot of their invocations they've used that we could use. And if anybody's got interested in that, speak up and I'll sit down and we'll chat about what we could do there. It would involve looking at the major municipalities in our area, maybe attending a city council meeting to see what's done in terms of prayer and asking, do you have the humanist, or could we provide a humanist prayer one time and this kind of thing? If you got interested in that, let me know. That's all. Free. You ready for a quick quiz?
Go right ahead.
All right. Quick quiz. So when you saw my H2 picture, what do you do when an engine stops in an H2?
Push in the clutch.
Right. It's automatic clutch. You go to an auto rotation. Actually, you fly home. The aircraft has two engines, and it actually can fly home on one engine, unless you've got a lot of payload. Pretty nice feature. The H2 was so overpowered. It was originally built as a single engine aircraft with the same engine, and they decided to put two engines on it, so we had power galore. Why don't helicopters go 750 miles an hour? I talked about 150, and then maybe there's some to 210 or something. Why don't helicopters go 750 miles an hour?
Is it aerodynamics?
It's aerodynamics. So if your blade is moving, let's say the blade's rotational speed varies based on how far it is out from the center to the tip. But let's say the average speed, I don't know, I'll pick a number, 100 miles an hour. And you're going 750 miles an hour that way. That means this blade is going 850 miles an hour that way. This blade is still going 100 miles an hour rotating, but it's got a tailwind of 750 miles an hour, so it's actually flying backwards. Right? You see what I'm saying? The retreating blade isn't aerodynamic. It's long before 750 miles an hour. The retreating blade is going backwards.
So what then, Jim? Do you lose lift on one side?
Yeah, well, or go to that point, you crash. I mean, you pitch up violently. It's a long story.
That could technically be losing lift. Yeah.
Pitch up when you never have a retreating blade stall, really, though. In test flying, they do some of that stuff. So where the retreating blade stalls out there. And the other question, the last question is, what do fixed wing pilots get concerned about when helicopter pilots do high power takeoffs? We'll talk about this. You're in a helicopter, you want to get out of the place quick. I mean, you're getting shot at, in Vietnam. You pitch the nose way over to get that fan moving you forward through the air, pulling a lot of power. You take off like mad. What that shows you is out the cockpit, you can see all the stones in the road, or you can see the weeds and everything, because your line of sight is right at the earth. In an airliner, when you're on the runway, you go down the runway, you're flying speed, you pull the stick back, and the sky's all up in the air. So when a fixed-wing pilot is in a helicopter doing a fast takeoff and sees that dirt and all the stuff in the ground, they think they're a nanosecond from crashing. In other words, I'm sort of gag here, but that is the depiction they see a nanosecond before the aircraft crashes and everybody dies. So they don't like this idea of seeing all the earth right in front of them. Anyway, so thanks for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we didn't make it too technical, did we? Or maybe a little too technical. The crowd here is mostly...
Oh, yeah. Round of applause to you. I like the technical stuff.
Thank you.
Okay, so I want to make a couple of observations. People might be wondering what this helicopter stuff has to do with humanism. One thing I was thinking as Jim was giving the talk was that us humanists, free thinkers, skeptics, atheists, we have a tendency to change our position and our opinion when new facts come in. I often thought if I had to fly, I've never flown, I would rather fly in a helicopter than a fixed wing airplane. Jim changed my mind. I've changed my position on that. And I think it may have been just yesterday I was saying something to Bill about something I always remember about my grandfather. He was renowned as a mechanic. And he used to say, people would tell him how wonderful he was and how smart he was for being able to fix things. And he used to say, he'd say, the guy that invented the first one, that guy was a genius. Any dumb shit can fix it. And whoever invented the helicopter, all the systems and all the complexity, I can't even imagine how somebody went through the process of inventing that. It's stunning and amazing. Jim, I hope that you could give a similar talk sometime when we have a larger crowd.
Yeah.
Sometime maybe post-pandemic or something like that, because that was a very enjoyable. So again, can we have another small round of applause for Jim? And we're a small group. We'll just discuss among ourselves if we want to go somewhere and have something to eat then. But thank you very much, Jim. Thanks so much.